All right, so today we're going to be doing part one of Reconstruction, and you can see that it's reuniting a broken nation. When we talk about Reconstruction in the United States, we're looking at the period after the Civil War officially ends. This period lasts about 12 years. Reconstruction historically comes to an end in about 1877. But with Reconstruction, you're really working, or excuse me, not working, looking at rebuilding the North and the South. So the problems of peace, so Reconstruction is really the process of rebuilding the South and reunifying the Union. So we know that the Civil War is officially going to break out in April of 1861. You're going to have the North that also becomes known as the Union. President Abraham Lincoln is really going to be at the helm there. And then, of course, you're going to have the South, which also becomes known as the Confederacy, and President Jefferson Davis is going to be at the helm there. You're going to have 4 years of fighting between the North or the Union and the South and the Confederacy before eventually in April of 1865, the war officially comes to an end when Robert E. Lee, the general for the Confederacy, surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant, who was at this point the general for the Union. Once that officially happens, the United States realizes we now need to bring the South back into the United States. They're no longer going to be the Confederacy. They're no longer going to be their own nation. But we have to figure out a way of reunifying the nation and bringing the South in a very peaceful way. With Abraham Lincoln, he's really going to come up with this idea of the 10% plan. And so the job of the president is really to unify the Union and to really sort of bring everybody together. And even when Abraham Lincoln is first elected to president in 1860, and when that Civil War breaks out, Lincoln very quickly takes a stance on the Civil War and slavery as a whole. His goal was not to end slavery at all. His goal was to preserve the Union. And as president, that really is your job. Whether or not you agree or disagree, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, you're supposed to try to unify everybody. And so Lincoln sort of realizes that once the Civil War ends, he's got to figure out a way to bring the South in. And so what he's going to do is come up with this 10% plan. And here's what the plan basically said. Was that 10% of Southern voters, and at this point it was really only white Southern voters, would be required to take an oath of loyalty before the state would be readmitted to the Union. Lincoln knows that the Southerners are not happy about losing the war, they're not happy about losing their slaves, and if he were to do something like, we're going to make 100% of all Southerners take this oath, there's absolutely no way Lincoln is ever going to get that. It's just not going to happen. So Lincoln really sort of feels that if we can get 10% of these white Southern males to take this oath of loyalty, we're going to slowly but surely bring these states back into the Union. Are they going to be happy? Probably not. Are they thrilled? Maybe not. But at least it's kind of like giving out this olive branch of, hey, we know you're unhappy. We know you're upset. But we want to bring you back into the United States of America. And again, at 10%, Lincoln sort of really felt that he was going to be able, to get that. Of course, we also know that with Lincoln, his goal was not to end slavery, was to preserve the Union. But that's definitely going to shift, especially when the Emancipation Proclamation gets issued in 1863. With the Emancipation Proclamation, though, it was an executive order. A lot of people sort of feel that the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the United States, and it didn't. And that's why they sought the 13th Amendment, which we've kind of already discussed in this class, but we'll get to a little bit later in this lecture. But the Emancipation Proclamation really didn't do anything. Basically, what the Emancipation Proclamation did was said any slaves that were basically under Confederate control were free. But in 1863, the Union had no control over the Confederacy, so it was nice in sentiment, but it didn't necessarily actually do anything. And it wasn't until that 13th Amendment actually gets implemented that slavery is officially going to be abolished and come to an end in the United States. There were lots of people who did not agree with Lincoln's 10% plan. And two of those people are going to be Wade and Davis. Wade and Davis were senators out of the state of Ohio and Maryland, and they looked at Lincoln's 10% plan and went, that's a bunch of BS. They're like, listen, the South, they committed treason. They seceded from the United States of America. They started this war, this bloody war that lasted 4 years, killed thousands of people, cost tons of money. We can't just take 10%. 10% is not even close to being enough. How can we trust that they're going to, enter the United States of America and not pull another stunt like this? They just completely disagree with this 10% plan altogether. So Wade and Davis are like, to ensure that this doesn't happen again, to make sure that another civil war isn't going to break out, we want more than 50% of white males to take this ironclad oath of allegiance before the state could call a constitutional convention. They want 50%. They're like, that's basically the majority. So if you can get a majority of white Southern males in these Southern states to take this oath of loyalty, that's going to give us a little bit more reassurance that, hey, this isn't going to happen again. The bill's also going to require that the states abolish slavery, but we know that with the 13th Amendment, that's going to be done on a federal level. And the bill's also going to require that black men are going to be able to be given the right to vote. And of course, who gets left out of that is going to be the women. Lincoln refused to sign the Wade-Davis bill. He did what's called a pocket veto. Pocket veto just means that he lets the bill basically sit on his desk for 10 days and then refuses to sign it, so the bill gets vetoed. So even though Congress had passed the Wade-Davis bill, Lincoln decides not to sign it into law because Lincoln really felt that this 50% was too much and he wasn't going to get it. Lincoln, as we know, though, that once the Civil War ends, he doesn't last much longer. About a week after the Civil War officially ends, on April 14th of 1865, President Lincoln is going to be shot and killed at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, and Andrew Johnson is going to take over as the presidency. Abraham Lincoln becomes the first president to be assassinated while in office. He's not the first to die, though. At this point, Lincoln will be the third president to die while in office, but the first to be assassinated. When we're saying the term assassination, it really just means you're killing somebody who's very high profile, typically in politics. So if somebody like me were to get murdered, they're not going to use the term assassination. It really is meant for high profile people. John Wilkes Booth was born in Virginia. He was a Southern man, was very much pro the Confederacy as well as pro slavery. So when Abraham Lincoln became president and the war broke out, he was definitely a Lincoln hater. There was no question about that. And throughout the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth had come up with several plans to either kill Lincoln, or at one point his plan was to kidnap Lincoln. And his idea was they're going to kidnap Lincoln, hold him hostage in order to release several thousand Confederate soldiers who had been captured and were POWs, prisoners of war. But once Robert E. Lee surrenders, John Wilkes Booth sort of realizes this kidnapping plan isn't going to work and decides that he's going to go ahead and kill Abraham Lincoln. The plan was also to kill Andrew Johnson, but the guy that had been sent after Andrew Johnson basically got cold feet and decided he wasn't going to try to kill him. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. He had done plays at Ford's Theater before, and he knew the play that Lincoln was going to be watching at Ford's Theater. And there was a part that comes up in the play in which the audience just erupts into this a lot of laughter. And so John Wilkes Booth sort of knew this was going to be my chance to basically kill him. So he enters up here in the balcony. He ends up shooting Lincoln, and then he drops from the balcony onto the stage. He says a line, and he takes off. At first, people didn't realize that Lincoln had been shot. They thought it was part of the play, but then eventually they sort of very quickly realized that Abraham Lincoln was indeed shot. John Wilkes Booth was on the run for about 2 weeks before he's eventually captured. He was hiding out in a barn. He refused to surrender. They light the barn on fire, and John Wilkes Booth is shot. They're not sure if he was shot by an officer or if it was a self-inflicted gun wound, but either way, the gun wound ends up paralyzing him, and he ends up dying a few hours later. All the co-conspirators who were caught were later hung to death. But Abraham Lincoln becomes the first president to be assassinated. The last president to be assassinated was JFK, or John F. Kennedy. And this is kind of like a little bit of an interesting thing. So this is Lincoln's funeral service. And here in the window is none other than Teddy Roosevelt, who at this time was 6 years old, who's later going to become a president of the United States as well. And ironically, Teddy Roosevelt's going to become president because William McKinley is going to be assassinated. So he's watching an assassinated president and becomes president because his president was assassinated. So a little bit about Johnson. So Andrew Johnson was a Tennessee man, but he was very loyal to Lincoln as well as the Union. He wasn't really for the South and for the Confederacy, which is one of the reasons that Lincoln had him on his ticket in the first place, was that he was a Southerner, but he was pro-Union. So he kind of did it as to help pull votes a little bit. Andrew Johnson was the vice president, so once Lincoln gets killed, he's going to become president. Although the 25th Amendment, which is that order of secession, wasn't in place yet, it had really been tradition that if something happens to the president, the vice president is going to take over. When Johnson becomes president, he's going to follow Lincoln's 10% plan, but he's going to add a couple of stipulations to it. One of them being that leading Confederates were to be disenfranchised. Disenfranchised meaning you cannot vote. Your ability to vote is taken away. So if like you are a prisoner, behind bars, you are disenfranchised. Your ability to vote no longer exists. All of you guys are under the age of 18. You are disenfranchised, right? We have an election coming up in November. I don't think any of you are going to be 18, so none of you have the ability to vote. Obviously, when you turn 18, that'll change, but you are disenfranchised. And then, of course, Johnson really felt that states must protect the rights of freedmen. And when we're talking freedmen, we're now talking about former slaves, because with the 13th Amendment, slavery is going to be abolished throughout the United States. A little bit more about Andrew Johnson. Under his presidency, he's going to purchase the territory of Alaska from the Russians. He purchases Alaska in 1867, and it's going to remain a territory of the United States until the 1950s, when Alaska officially becomes a state. Also, Andrew Johnson becomes the first president to be impeached. However, it was not successful, and he was able to retain his presidency. There have been a total of 3 presidents that have been impeached: Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. None of them have been convicted. Richard Nixon, who was president during the late 60s and early 70s, would have likely been impeached because of Watergate, but before he could actually be impeached, he decided to go ahead and resign from office, becoming the only president to ever resign. Skip that. So when we're looking at military reconstruction, so the Reconstruction Act divided the South into 5 military districts. So U.S. soldiers would be stationed each to make sure that things stayed under control. Again, the Union doesn't really trust the South. The South isn't exactly happy about losing the war. Again, they're not happy about losing their slaves. And so the U.S. decides we need to keep an eye on the South. And so we're going to split the South into these 5 southern districts where the military is essentially going to be keeping an eye on things, making sure that no one gets another bright idea to try to secede from the United States and start a second civil war. You're also going to have 3 amendments that pass that become known as the Reconstruction Amendments. You have the 13th Amendment. This is officially going to abolish slavery throughout the United States. Like I said, the Emancipation Proclamation was really the first mention of getting rid of slavery throughout the entire United States, but it was an executive order, and Congress had really sort of feared that that executive order was going to be challenged, which is why they sought an amendment in the first place. So because they weren't sure if the Emancipation Proclamation would hold up, they sought the 13th Amendment, which again officially gets rid of slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment, it's going to give citizenship to all freed men. Really what it says is that if you are born in the United States, you were automatically considered a U.S. citizen. Now that slavery is abolished, all these people who were considered property are now actual human beings. And so because of that, they need to be given citizenship, because at this point, pretty much all the slaves in the United States were born in the United States. So what that 14th Amendment is going to do is give former slave citizenship, because again, before the 13th Amendment, they weren't considered people, they were considered property. And of course, the 15th Amendment is going to give suffrage to all freed men. Suffrage meaning the ability to vote, but this of course only goes to men of color, and the women are going to get left out. Now, just because the 15th Amendment gives all men the right to vote, it doesn't mean that all men are going to have the ability to vote. And tomorrow when we continue on with part 2 of Reconstruction, we're going to look at all the different ways that the southern states in particular are going to find a way to make sure that people can't vote at the polls. Reconstruction officially comes to an end in 1877, which becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. When the presidential election was really contested, they decided that they would go ahead and give it to Rutherford B. Hayes, who was going to become the presidency, and in exchange, these military districts are officially going to come to an end. And so once that happens, many people consider Reconstruction to be over in the United States.